Okay, we're running a little bit behind time, but I thought that that discussion was very interesting, and I think there is a much more diverse ecology out there than a lot of people think about. And when I think about the debate in the media and its polarization on alternative providers versus the received idea of what a university is, I think there's quite a lot of work to be done. One of the things that I said in my introduction was this question about businesses' anxieties about whether or not students were work ready, business ready, and whether or not that was even part of the function of some universities and courses. I think if you go to the University of Exeter, if any of you saw the courtroom in Broadchurch, that's actually the employability centre at Exeter, and every student has to go through the employability centre, and they look at what they can do to enhance their employability prospects. And Steve Smith, the Vice-Chancellor there, who was President of Universities UK, and others take this very seriously. But also, as Sarah Hardcastle from the Marketeers Carrington Christ was saying, their studies 10 years ago would have shown that students were interested in lifestyles. So you had vice-chancellors showing, you know, nightlife in Liverpool, the excitements of de Montfort in Leicester, lots of socialising, etc. But now it's career. And they are very interested in the outcomes on all of that. We've got two contributions in this session and then a panel discussion. The first is from Professor Ray Land, who I first saw this presentation at Association of Business Schools event that we were putting on. And I have been watching these kinds of presentations about teaching and learning for nearly 35 years, since I was president of the NUS, actually, in the early 80s. And it was the first time that I really sat up and paid attention. So I was very keen to get Ray here to invite people to think differently about universities and how they teach and what it is they have to communicate to their students. And so, Ray, without any more of that, I'll hand over to you.
Right, thank you, Neil, and thank you, colleagues, for coming along, for the invitation to talk about it. Yeah, I'm going to talk about the notion of higher education being a process of transformation in students. The notion that actually you are what you know and that knowledge changes you personally. And I'm going to talk about something called threshold concepts and something called troublesome knowledge. The clue is in the title, in that this is a form of knowledge which troubles students and unsettles them, disrupts their ways of seeing. So you can see from the outset that this is going to be something which doesn't necessarily contradict the notion of students as consumers, but it complicates that notion, it problematizes it. A colleague of mine, a Scottish colleague, who has a wonderfully rich Scottish accent like Neil, so I wouldn't try and copy it, but if you can imagine it in those tones. I used to tell the students that, you know, you think you're in a kind of hotel here, but in fact, it's a gym. You know, we're not providing services here. We're providing you with an environment in which you can change. You can't commodify transformation. You can buy nice accommodation, you can buy nice catering, you can buy nice Wi-Fi. You can't purchase personal transformation, and I'll come back to this. This is something which students have to engage in themselves. And what this guy also used to say to students, you call yourselves the customers, and to some extent you are, but you're also the product of higher education. And in fact, he said, you're not even that, you're the raw material at this point, which usually kind of got their backs up. So we'll come on to these notions, and it's a different view, but it's based on 15, 16 years of research we've been doing into the kinds of transformations, into the ways of thinking and practicing that businesses and industry and professions require. You know, what does it mean to think and practice like an economist? What does it mean to think and practice like an architect or a surgeon or an engineer or a designer in the age that we are now living in? Just before I come on to that, just by way of a kind of slight digression, you know, we're here in Oxford. This image I've got up, I'm not trying to compete with the architectural bling of Oxford, but this is Durham Cathedral, which was probably the greatest seat of learning in Britain between the 8th and 12th centuries. Then this upstart, Oxford, came along. And the Benedictine monks at Durham decided, well, we can't beat them, we'll join them. They opened a college here in Durham called Durham College, interestingly. If you go into Trinity College now, there's still a Durham quad, and the library in Trinity College was Durham College. It was there for 300 years, and then it went in the Reformation. The reason I mention this is that the reason it didn't survive as an old provider, not a new provider, is because people's ways of seeing the world changed. This was the rise of humanism, which gave, the Copernican revolution, gave rise to Protestant thinking, gave rise to science, capitalism, mercantilism, so on. The Benedictine world didn't cope with that well, and it went out of business. But the point I'm going to make is that a lot of people did not like these changes. This was troublesome knowledge. Looking at the world in this way, in a geocentric way rather than a theocentric way, a heliocentric world where the Earth goes around the sun, this was strange knowledge which disrupted it. In fact, we still don't entirely accept the Copernican world. We still talk about sunrise and sunset. The sun doesn't rise, it doesn't set. But we still want to kind of hang on to that old world. So this leads into the point that, well, what is the purpose of higher education? Ron Barnett, professor at London University, has said quite provocatively, the purpose of higher education is to take students into strange places. He says, these are anxiety-provoking places. And I don't think you'd put that in your prospectus, but what he says is if there isn't an element of that, you're probably not getting higher education. Lee Shulman, who's one of my heroes, who's director of the Carnegie Center in the States for many years, talked about the need for pedagogies of uncertainty. If we're going to, we've spoken over the last 2 days about a world of uncertainty, complexity, risk, speed, and so on that our graduates are already in, not need to prepare for. These are unprecedented times. We are in an age of uncertainty. The kind of neoliberal project is a bit wedded, to certainty, I think, in many respects. But our students are going to have to cope with uncertainty. Shulman said that we should design programs which bring that into the university and get people comfortable with it. The interesting thing about Shulman's model as well is that there's a strong emotional dimension to this. He says one must have something at stake in this. There will be anxiety and risk. I love this quote, no emotional investment, no intellectual or formational yield. Nothing exciting is going to happen if there isn't that kind of emotional engagement as well. And this takes us into the notion of transformational learning and troublesome knowledge. Now, knowledge is troublesome in many ways. We haven't got time to talk about it here, but I'll give you a link at the end if you're interested in this. Our collaborator in this research, David Perkins at Harvard, used this term. Knowledge can be troublesome because it's tacit, we don't explain it properly, or because it's counterintuitive. If you ask graduates often of physics about Newtonian notions of motion, say, do you really believe them? They say, well, we know it's right, yes, but do you believe it? That when you hit one object, it accelerates and that kind of thing. They often say, well, actually, no, it's a bit odd. Knowledge, it can be counterintuitive, it can be inert because we don't use it enough. It can also be because the learner is defended. We don't want to kind of go into that world. It can just be conceptually very difficult. But in higher education, in preparing students for professions and business, they are going to encounter troublesome knowledge. They need to encounter it. Dewey, the great American educator, said that really is the most difficult bit about learning. It takes troublesome work to undertake the alteration of old beliefs. And Keynes said something similar, that it's not new ideas that are the issue, it's getting rid of the old ones, which ramify into every corner of our minds, and actually into every corner of our being in that sense. And I think this brings us into transformational learning and the notion that higher education is about changing how you are. If we want to use fancy terminology, changing the ontology of students or their subjectivity. I quite like this little diagram of transformation from Mark Escher. And that there's a kind of middle bit in this of where the transformation changes, where the birds actually, if you look at it, seem as if they're suddenly flying backwards. And then suddenly you realise they're not birds, they're fish. And students can go through this kind of transitional in-between stage. And it can be disconcerting like that. They can't see where it's going. It feels uncomfortable. It feels like they're having to let go of stuff, and they are. And we don't like that. In fact, I once asked an entomologist. I was going to use the kind of butterfly, cheesy image of metamorphosis. I said, actually, what is in a chrysalis? When you get this caterpillar and there's wonderful transformation into a butterfly, but what's in the chrysalis? And she said, oh, it's just like dust. Everything is just kind of reduced down and then reconstructed, which is an interesting metaphor. And Barnett, coming back to Barnett, said, if we are seriously claiming that we're preparing students to think and practice for the business world for an uncertain future, it would seem irrational to predicate our learning models on increasing certainty. Very precise learning objectives, outcomes, and so on. Clearly we need structures to our curricula and so on. But if we're framing them through transformations of being, that brings up a different way of looking at learning. And he produced this interesting little model where he was saying, if we've long had curricula where there isn't really much risk in terms of the disciplinary knowledge. It's settled knowledge that's given, and a lot of courses are just settled knowledge. And the skills are that they assume ontologies that we already have and ways of being that we already have. The example Neil gave yesterday of the students at Manchester University is saying, well, we don't want that settled knowledge in post-crash economics any longer. We don't want pre-crash economics. We want something in the top right-hand corner there. We want some new, wonderful disciplinary shift in seeing the world differently economically. But what Barnett would say is, well, that's fine, but that knowledge will also require a shift in you. You will have to see the world differently. So, for example, there's a difference between being an environmental economist, where you are a traditional economist who just happens to focus on the environment, and being, for example, an ecological economist who actually thinks like an ecologist. That's a shift in ontology. That is a transformational shift. Or a feminist economist. That's a similar shift. So those would be shifts of an ontological nature in transformation, and they are riskier. They are less settled. But what Barnett would argue, and I think I would too, is that we need to be thinking more on the right-hand side of the spectrum in our curricula than on the more settled, less risky side. And this leads me into talking about thresholds very, very briefly. One of my colleagues in Ohio, Leslie Schwartzman, said all threshold concepts is basically about encountering the unknown, taking students into strange places. And when I worked at Edinburgh, I used to pass this threshold every morning on the high street in Edinburgh on my way to work. The Latin says, peace to those coming in and safety to those going out. And it reminds you that what thresholds often do is they demarcate a safer space from a riskier space. If you think of the kind of portals into Oxford colleges here, shut at night, they seal off that kind of more familiar domestic space than the street outside where anything can happen. And learning is a little bit about that as well. We often kind of create more sheltered spaces in that sense. The quadrangle is a kind of classic example of that, with its back to the world. In a digital world, all that's transgressed and opened up now. And we are taking students across boundaries into spaces they haven't been before. I like this image of a portal or a threshold for two reasons. One is we can glimpse an untraveled world there, which we're not in, that students are not in. But you get the impression if we moved into that space, other things would come into view. And that's very often how it is for students as they're going through a program. They hear students in final year or postgrads talking about things they haven't encountered yet, but know that they are going to encounter. But the other thing about this portal is this sort of in-between space, which is neither here nor there, between this world we're in, a more certain world, and that uncertain world. The Latin term for that space is limen, L-I-M-E-N, which gives the word liminality, which anthropologists talk about. Liminality is a space of transition, like adolescence or like bereavement. And what you often get in those liminal spaces is a kind of oscillation and uncertainty and frustration, anger, a lot of emotion. And very often you can't see where it's going. You can't glimpse that traveled world. Teenage years, oscillate between childhood and adulthood and so on. A lot of learning involves these liminal states. And when students have finished courses, when they've finished programs, they are very often still in liminal states. You know, we can't assume that when students have finished a module or finished a degree, they've got it. They've got all the outcomes and so on. Our research suggests is they're all over the place. They're all kinds of different stages. Most of them have got a partial degree of understanding of it, but they're still in liminal states, even when they enter business and so on. And you often hear business people saying, don't they teach you anything at university and so on. These things, what is new to be integrated hasn't been resolved yet. But also, it's not just about going into new conceptual and emotional landscapes. It's about seeing them differently, like the people in the college back in the Reformation there. You've got to see the world differently. As Prof says, you need to see the world with the eyes of another. And very often, the other, in that sense, might be business people, and it might be leaders in industry and so on. So in this liminal state, you encounter something new that has to be integrated, which you usually can't integrate unless you let go of your prevailing scheme of seeing things and recognize the shortcomings of that. And you have to let go of that older view. You also have to let go of that earlier version of you. You have to be in a position to envisage a transformed version of yourself the other side of that threshold. As Etienne Wenger says, if you're going to join a community of practice, you have to be able to anticipate yourself in that community of practice. If you think of becoming a senior manager, for example, and the kind of ontological shift that requires, someone who can lay off people, make very difficult decisions, and so on, can you envisage yourself doing that? If not, you probably will not go through that portal. You will remain a defended learner. And that's fair enough. Some students won't do that. You have to undo the script of yourself, as Jen Ross says, and reauthor yourself. And you can tell when this is happening because people start talking differently. They start using different forms of discourse. If you want to see a nice example of this happening, watch the film Educating Rita, where you see Rita going to university as a young previous hairdresser, studying at university, and see the very challenging transformations she goes through. Very upsetting. Dislocates her from her social class, busts up her marriage. She becomes a more complex figure, and she speaks and dresses very differently. It's a very powerful experience. And what I'm suggesting is, and I'll give a link, as I say, in where we've got about 1,800 papers in about 150 disciplines where people are talking about trying to bring about these transformations. It's important for professions and businesses themselves in a time of uncertainty to identify what these threshold points are. What are these key points of transformation that a university program will need to cover? Even if the transformation probably won't be completed whilst you're at university, because these are often protracted, messier situations. I use a medical image here. These are students doing their first dissection of a cadaver. Medicine is a very powerful example, I think, of the kind of transformation in subjectivity that you have to undergo to become a medic, to become a surgeon, even more so. But all learning involves these kinds of shifts. Part of the issue, though, is identifying what these key transformations are. And a lot of our work, for example, I have a doctoral student at the moment working with entrepreneurs, saying, what does it mean to think and practice as an entrepreneur? Not like an entrepreneur, but as an entrepreneur in that sense. Where do you get that information from? Who can articulate it? How do you reach a consensus on that? It's very, very interesting work. But if you want to know more about these thresholds, they have these characteristics. They transform you. You have to integrate something difficult. They take you across boundaries. They're irreversible. This is the other thing. You don't, for example, a threshold students encounter now, even at primary school, is evolution. If you really understand evolution, you have to see the world very differently. You have to let go of earlier ways of seeing the world, earlier emotional states about the world. And that can be very unsettling. And there are lots of many adults. I gave a talk recently in Utah in the States. This didn't go down very well, talking about evolution in this way. But it reconstitutes you as a person. And you don't say, what was that stuff we did, 2 weeks ago, which undermined all my religious beliefs and completely altered the way I see the world? I've forgotten. Can you just remember? It doesn't operate like that. Because there is this shift in subjectivity. It's like a ratchet effect. You are reconstituted by it. You talk it more differently and so on. But these transformations are troublesome. Students often are upset by them, they're challenged by them. We have to create holding environments where we support students from them. It's quite like this little image from the Limburg brothers it's a little Flemish painting of the Garden of Eden and the creation myth. In that image, two things going on there. Eden is presented, first of all, as a kind of fortified medieval city. It's a very protected space. Outside is all the uncertainty and chaos, all the Brexit stuff, going on out there. Inside it, we have order and certainty. God is there. Everything is the same. Every day is the same. Until the serpent arrives. The other image we can refer to there it's rather uterine, isn't it? It's a rather womb-like image. And it has a threshold at the end of it. Once the serpent comes, that world is disrupted. It's upset. Adam and Eve are changed by that knowledge. Their response is rather like modern students. Eve is curious. There's a curiosity. Oh, what's this? Shall I do this module? What's this about? Is this a good program? Adam's is resistant. Let's not do this. Or will this be in the exam? That's kind of Adam's thing. Will we get credit? Will we get credit for this? They do engage with it, however, but the knowledge changes them to the extent that they can't stay in that world any longer. This is a world of innocence. The knowledge, whatever it is, changes them. And the angel says, you have to go. They don't want to go. It's very nice in that world. It's very comfortable. It's very safe. It's very certain. But they can't stay in it. When they leave, they're upset. It feels like that. It feels like post-Brexit in that sense. But they get on. But two other points that come out of this, which I think are interesting for teaching as well. We have had a lot of emphasis in the last 2 decades on switching away from didactic teaching to, from the sage on the stage and so on to facilitative teaching and students, doing stuff on their own, learning by doing, discovery learning and so on. And this has been a helpful swing and an emphasis on constructivism. Students actually having to make sense of knowledge internally, as it were. And that is fine. However, there are limits to that, and I think we're in danger of swinging too much in the opposite way. If you are going to change the parameters of a student's world and disrupt their habituated practices and ways of seeing, that change will come from outside. It will transcend the horizons of your world. This is transcendent teaching, which Kierkegaard talks about. Socrates' view was that everything is win and you just have to bring it out. What pretentious academics like me call maiutics. We never use a good English word when we can use a pretentious Greek word. Maiutics means a midwifery view of learning. The teacher kind of helps the student give birth to this knowledge from within. This troublesome knowledge doesn't come from within. People will quite happily go on retaining the certainty of their existing world until they encounter another who will disrupt it. And this is another pretentious Latin word, alterity. The notion of otherness is required in higher education. Now, that otherness may not necessarily have to come from academics. It can come from, we've been talking about apprenticeships, we've been talking about internships. That encounter with troublesome knowledge, that changed perspective, may very well come through placements. I work in a school of education. I notice very much when students come back from their placements, how their world has changed. We give them theory and they say, yeah. When they operate in practice, and you see this with medics, you see it with engineers, you see it with designers, when they enter the community of practice, that is very often when they encounter the troublesome knowledge. And this is when they encounter others. But there's, and I'll finish here, but there's a kind of double truth giving, as Vessel calls it here. It's not this, that we need to present students with knowledge that they are not likely to encounter within the parameters of their own world. Adam and Eve could have stayed in there forever. The serpent came in from outside and said, try this. The serpent is the other in this sense. Serpent gets a bad press in the West, but serpent's our hero in terrestrial concept. The serpent is the bringer of change, the bringer of troublesome knowledge in that sense. The serpent is, we need others in that sense. But it's not just that they bring the new knowledge, it's that students are not in a position to make judgments about that knowledge without the help of teachers. as Vassell says, you're presenting students with something that is neither derivable from nor validated by what they already know. They have to be shown how you validate and recognize the truth of this new knowledge in that sense. So there's another form of understanding and judgment going on there. And again, that can come from the communities of practice, and very often does come from the communities of practice in that regard. Hence the need for links with business and industry. Okay, but as we said at the beginning, I'll finish here, yes, students are our customers, they're paying a lot of money, we want them to have a great time, we want them to have a good student experience. Even in Durham College in the 14th century, they had a new tunic and a new hood every 6 months. I don't think they had washing machines then, so I think they probably needed a new tunic. However, the notion that student life is problem-free in that sense, or is a state of satisfaction. I think our quality regimes overemphasize student satisfaction. They should be asking more like the National Survey of Student Engagement in the States. Not are you happy, but how do you spend your time? And what is the most profitable use of your time? So, we're all jumping for joy. I have to say, in 40 years of teaching, and I've never ever seen students do that. Maybe I don't thrill them with, and they're not tumescent with glee in that sense. But, however, I think, we do need to get away from the idea that, as was mentioned earlier on, HE is maybe just a lifestyle choice. Okay, but as I said, there's a very large site kept at UCL about our work in this area. And if you go to that, if you just search on thresholds, and Mick Flanagan maintains this wonderful site. It's got about 1,800 papers, it's got lots of videos, it's got 50 PhD theses. More than you'd want to know about thresholds and transformational in a whole lifetime. I'll stop there. Okay. Thanks.
Just to elaborate on that final point, so Ray and his colleagues and others have taken these insights, but you've worked them through, as you say, with medics, with departments. You've gone down into what we talk about as segments, etc. So actually, you must have caused quite a lot of trouble with academics as well.
Yes.
Asking them to create troublesome environments.
Yeah, absolutely.
And agree thresholds with the input of people from the outside.
Well, actually, the one, to be fair to academics, the one thing about academics, they don't like being turned into educationists, but they will always talk about their discipline, as we were discussing yesterday. They are passionate. That's why they come into higher education. They're passionate about biology or history or whatever. They will talk forever about their discipline, and they are happy to talk about what it means to think like a historian, and what that will involve. So in that sense, we've found that this is an area they will talk about education. And there are about 150 disciplines on that site with stuff, and a lot of it's downloadable. So
and that micro and granular stuff, I think, and you can see more of Ray's presentations are available on Policy Review TV in other events, and I can send you the links because it is quite fascinating.